Speakers today are Alia Malek, Raja Shahdehah, Rabih Alameddine, and they'll appear in conversation with Susan Abulhawa. Susan Abulhawa is a Palestinian novelist, poet, and political essayist. Her debut novel, Mornings in Jenin, was an international bestseller and translated into 28 languages. She is also a biologist and the founder of Playgrounds for Palestine, a non-profit children's organization. She will introduce the other speakers. Please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Alia Malek, Raja Shahdehah, Rabih Alameddine, and Susan Abulhawa.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this panel on writing the Arab world. It's an honor to be with my colleagues, Raja, Alia, and Rabih. When I was contemplating this idea of writing the Arab world, I admit it was a bit challenging because the phrase writing the Arab world has some assumptions that are not necessarily true. Chief among them is this idea that there really is something called the Arab world that is more or less homogeneous and monolithic. So I want to grapple with these ideas with three writers from the Levant, which is the western region of what we know as the Middle East. It encompasses Syria, Palestine, Lebanon, and most parts of Jordan. So I guess it's better to call it writing the Levant. One of the things that I'm keen to touch on also is something that Pico Iyer talked about in the opening remarks at the festival, and that is this idea of cultural appropriation, which I think is better termed cultural colonialism, because I think that better describes the phenomena. So I'm getting ahead of myself, but I want to start first with Raja Shahdehah. Raja is a Palestinian writer. He's based in the occupied city of Ramallah. Raja is also a lawyer. He has written 10 books, including memoirs and law books. And Raja is the founder of Al-Haq, which is a very prominent Palestinian human rights organization. Welcome, Raja. In the description of this panel in the booklet, the description asks, what has happened to Arab culture? And the implication is that where is this culture that was once splendid and admired the world over? What is your reaction to that statement or that question?
My reaction, first of all, I must say that I will confine my comments to Palestine, which is what I know. Sorry, is this better? Yeah. First of all, I want to say that I will confine my comments to Palestine, about which I know more than the rest of the Arab world. And I want to say that whether it's Palestine or the rest of the Arab world, the statement I don't think is true, because there is a flourishing of culture, even though much of it might not be known in the West. I attended a session in this festival on India in the 18th century called The World Turned Upside Down. And the panelists in this session made the point that after the Mughal Empire collapsed and there was fragmentation and chaos, there was a great flourishing of the arts, and some of the best art was produced ever in India. Now, I have no means of checking whether this is correct or not, but this is what the panelists proposed. And when I heard this, I thought that this is not unsimilar to the case of Palestine. Our world was turned upside down in 1948 with the Nakba, the exile, the forcing out of the Palestinians out of their homes and country in Palestine. And as a result, we lost everything, and we became denied of our history and the fact that we existed. We had to prove that we existed. And as Ilyas Khouri, a Lebanese writer who wrote a number of books about Palestine, has said the Palestinian refugees had to construct their nation out of words. And I think that has been absolutely true in more than one sense. But as a result of this denial of existence, there has been a flourishing in the various arts, whether it is in filmmaking, whether it's in dance, whether it's in theater, whether it's in literature and books, and so on. The visual artist Emily Jasser, I think, did something which exemplifies the state of the Palestinians in this day. Her work, it's an art installation called Where We Came From. And she went around the world asking Palestinians who are scattered all over the world, in Japan, in the Americas, in everywhere, in Europe, in the Far East. And she went to them and asked, most of these people are unable to even visit their home in Palestine. And she asked, if I could do anything for you in Palestine, what would that be? And what they told her, she took down word by word. Some people said, go to this particular area and play football with any youngster you find there. Some people said, go to this particular restaurant in Nazareth and eat hummus for me. And some person who is not far from Jerusalem told her, I've been trying to mail this letter, which I need to mail to the outside world. Could you take it to Jerusalem post office and mail it for me? And what she did was to do exactly what she was asked to do, take a photograph and write down the exact words which they said and present it in an exhibit. And every time I've seen this exhibit, I have teared because it describes in such honest ways the state of the Palestinians at this point. Israel, a few years ago, has made it illegal to commemorate the Nakba, which is at the heart of the Palestinian reality and suffering. I think the phoenix-like existence of Palestinians out of the ashes was well expressed by a poem called In Jerusalem by the great poet Mahmoud Darwish. And he ends the poem with the lines after he asks, who am I? With these words, a woman soldier shouted, is that you? Didn't I kill you? I said, you killed me, and I forgot, like you, to die. Thank you.
I think I'm glad you mentioned the works of Emily Jasser and Mahmoud Darwish, because both of these artists write from the terrain of what I feel is our collective wound. And this is a great springboard for my question to you, Alia. Alia Malek is a Syrian-American writer. She's a journalist. She's written 3 books, is that right? 3? And which have received a great deal of acclaim in the United States and abroad. Alia, you picked up and from a comfortable life in Baltimore, Maryland, and decided to move to Syria at the height of violence and war and oppression. And can you talk to us a little bit about the impetus for that, and sort of going back to the idea of cultural colonialism, and tell us why it was important for you not just to narrate from a metaphorical terrain of Syria's agony, but from the literal terrain of that, and just tell us about that process, and also tell us why you as a Syrian, and why it's important for Syrian voices to narrate Syrian lives as opposed to non-Syrians.
Okay, in 5 minutes or less. Hi, everybody. I asked this yesterday at my panel just because I'm always curious. So now we represent Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine. Has anybody here been to any of those places? Okay, it's a little bit more than yesterday when I asked just about Syria. Well, thank you for coming here and showing an interest in this. So basically, I moved to I was meant to be raised in Syria. My family was meant to live in Syria. My parents were in the United States temporarily. In fact, my mom had left Damascus in 1974, pregnant with me, but a series of events happened basically because of the Assad regime that had, when she left for the United States, was only in power for 4 years, but by 1980 had solidified and consolidated its power. And that meant that a family member was murdered by the regime, and the house that she was meant to raise me in, and the house that she was raised in, was taken away from us with the express blessings of the state. It was sort of a state-sanctioned taking. And so my parents made this decision to stay in the US, and then throughout my life I went back frequently to Damascus, but always sort of as this outsider / visitor. And then I made the decision to become a human rights lawyer and then a journalist, and these are the kinds of careers that are hazardous to your health in Syria. So I could never be a professional adult in Syria. I actually lived and worked in both Lebanon and Palestine as a lawyer, and it was always sort of like an interesting paradox that I could be the professional side of myself in these two countries, but not in the one that I was supposedly I am a citizen of and meant to be a part of. And part of that is because, just to give you, the tragedies that have happened to the Levant, a place that was once sort of one administrative state under the Ottoman Empire, have, Lebanon, Palestine, and Syria have taken three very different paths since the ending of the Ottoman Empire almost 100 years ago. But what sort of marked Syria for a long time, even before 2011, was this very, very stifling totalitarian state. So has anybody here ever heard of the Mukhabarat? Okay, so these are, for those of you who don't know, this is basically like the Syrian version of the East German Stasi. I imagine more people have heard about the Stasi, right? So there's this wonderful joke I heard in Syria in the 90s, so it will kind of explain to you what the Mukhabarat are like. Basically, they are supposed to function like the Stasi, but whereas the Stasi are quite precise because they're German, the Mukhabarat absolutely have no precision, but what they lack in precision, they more than make up for with zeal. And the joke goes like this, and this is in the days of the Soviet Union. The Mossad, the CIA, the KGB, and the Mukhabarat are all taken to this elite training site for different kinds of secret police agents. And they each have to perform one task. They have to go into the forest, they have to find a fox, they have to retrieve it, and they have to come back out. Have you heard this joke? So the CIA and the KGB both complete the task in 30 minutes. In the Syrian telling, the Israelis take 15 minutes to do it because they were sort of always understanding that we were outgunned, even if our nationalist rhetoric suggested otherwise. The Syrians take like 4 hours. And when they come back, they don't have a fox. They have a severely beaten up bunny rabbit. And the other agents are like, this is not a fox. And the Syrians are unfazed. They're all wearing those standard issue black leather jackets. And the leader takes the drag of a cigarette and he says, he confessed, he is a fox. So in that environment, I could never be a human rights lawyer who had worked in Palestine. You can't even say the word Palestine. You can say Palestine, you can't say Israel. We call it Disneyland in Syria when we're speaking out loud. Because we say even the walls have ears. The taxi drivers are notorious informants. Anybody could inform on you at any time. So there's this super stifling apparatus that sort of keeps the people in check. I mean, and you have to understand that the regime is now in power almost 50 years. So to maintain that kind of subjugation of generations of Syrian requires a whole hell of a lot of fear. When the Arab Spring started, I like to say that even though I was born in 1974, it felt like a moment I had been waiting for since 1967, because what happened to the Arab world in 1967 at the defeat at the hands of the Israelis sort of kind of brought everything to a grinding halt in many ways. I mean, there was a flourishing and there's always been amazing flourishing of art and cultural production. So the framing of this entire panel is kind of silly, quite frankly. But it felt like something was finally going to give in a region where nothing had given in so long. And so I thought that maybe this was my opportunity to move to Syria. We had just taken the house back. So I thought I would be working on this, I had a cover story for all the sort of inquiring people who would want to know why was an American in Syria, a Syrian American, but an American nonetheless, in Syria at this point. I could say, well, I'm renovating my grandmother's house. I'm not doing journalism. I'm not doing law, human rights stuff, those terrible concepts. And so I had this cover story, and I thought that what was going to happen, I thought Syria was on the precipice of something potentially better. Obviously, that's not the way that it went, and I thought I'd be sort of writing a book about restoring a house at the same time that Syrians were restoring their country. That metaphor came apart. And the reason one of the reasons I wanted to go there was I didn't know what role could I play in a new Syria, having had access to good education, having had a chance to live in both Lebanon and Palestine, and being able to bring that comparative experience. And I also, in the meantime, knew that there would be a lot of journalism and a lot of writing produced about the place, because there's nothing that foreign correspondents like more than a war or a crisis. And in fact, I had always wanted to write a book on Syria, and my agent always told me to forget it. And there was never a market for a book on Syria until the country began to fall apart. And that's something to sort of think about, why it is we only care about these places in their devastation. And I thought that if I were to produce any journalism out of that situation, it would read differently. And in fact, I did. When people were writing about the Bang Bang, I wrote anonymously, like a front page New York Times story about an underground aid network where Syrians themselves were trying to deliver medicines to areas that had been devastated, and that the regime did not want people to reach. So I think the eye of looking at Syrians not as the sort of bit players in a big story about geopolitics and war, but rather foregrounding them as the principal players in the stories about their lives, was something that I wanted to do, and why I felt if there were a role for me to play in producing knowledge about Syria for people who are reading in English, then I wanted to be able to do it from there.
Can you address the second part of the question, though, that why it was important for you as a Syrian to narrate? And do you think it's the same as someone outside of the culture who doesn't have the history of cultural nuance and growing up in that culture to narrate from a Syrian collective wound like that?
So let me just first say, being Syrian does not qualify you right away to write about Syria, nor do I think just the fact of being Lebanese or Palestinian means that you automatically can write about it. I also do a lot of research and reporting, and I know enough to know what I don't know, so I know to go out and find it. And that's not to say that somebody from outside Syria can't do that. If somebody from outside Syria studies its history and learns its language, I don't know how people can cover places and not speak the local language, or take on the voice of a protagonist in a language that they don't speak. I mean, to me, I feel like there was not any dissent about that in some of the earlier panels, but to me that's unreal. And I think the reality is, from the outside, Syria has been the subject of colonial interventions, from the Ottomans to the French to the global Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States, and then the regional ones between Jordan, Egypt, now Iran, and Saudi Arabia. And that's not to say we can't have outside perspectives, but we have way more of those perspectives than we have of inside perspectives. And so it's not that I'm not a consummate insider either, nor am I the only insider outsiders. But what you can do as a journalist is sort of I had access to Syrians that I think other journalists would not have had access to.
So Rabih, let me move on to you. Rabih Alameddine is a Lebanese-American writer based in both Beirut and San Francisco. Rabih has written 5 novels and a collection of short stories. He has received high literary accolades, multiple awards, and much laudation from literary circles all over the world. Rabih, I want to go back to the question that I asked Raja pertaining to the description in the booklet about this panel. The description the description sort of gives the impression that there aren't a lot of cultural artistic productions among Arab societies. And I think, well, first of all, I'd like to know if you think that's accurate, and if you don't, why do you think there is this perception of us as being bereft of cultural production and maybe even bereft of artistic impulse sometimes? I feel like there is almost sometimes a surprise when we produce beautiful artistic works. So what's your reaction to that, and why do you think that is in the world?
My first reaction is I didn't read the description of the panel. I've never been on a panel where I pay attention to what it's supposed to be about, because it never goes that way. I mean, I would say it's insulting, but it really isn't. The trouble is, if you, when you mentioned it, I looked at the description I looked at it, and it was apparently a quote by Hanan al-Sheikh. So it's not coming from the outside, it's coming from us, which I find interesting, that whatever you think of her work, she's a preeminent writer, would actually think that there has been nothing since Alhambra, basically. It is, if you're asking me what I think about it, it's a longer discussion than what we could have here in a panel. But it's primarily the remnant of sort of colonialism, if you want to say that. We come from a part of the world where everything European is better than ours. Personal stories, one of my books was a bestseller. I think it was a #1 bestseller in a Lebanese bookstore. And I saw this woman, she's dressed fabulously, as gorgeous, gorgeous, gorgeous sunglasses. And she's looking at the books and she sees, oh, this looks fabulous. And she picks up my book and I'm sitting next to her. And she goes, oh, this looks so exciting. And then she turns it back and sees my name and says in French, il est local, and puts it back. She says he's local. And I don't know much about Indian culture, but I assume you have the same things. It's the nature of the remnants of sort of that everything European is better, light skin is better, blue eyes are better, their philosophy is better. The one thing that they haven't been able to do is say that the food is better.
Or in the case of Israel, they just call it Israeli. Sorry.
But so again, I find that interesting. I'm not sure whether culture is, we produce enough culture, but if I look at the West and what it is producing, I don't see much culture either. So for me, I never pay attention to stuff like that. I have enough trouble writing my novel to worry about what other people are doing. Except on Twitter.
Except on what? Oh.
Except on Twitter. Then I get upset.
So you touch on something interesting, and I was just thinking about when you were talking that this kind of internalized Orientalism, in a way, internalized racism, that the way that we view things European as being so much better than what we produce. You write fiction. You and I write fiction, and when you're writing your characters, do you try and check yourself for like maybe internalized Orientalism, or are you aware of sort of an imperial gaze when you write? Do you think about whether what you're writing will be fetishized by readers who aren't Arab, and even Arab readers?
Do I think about it? No. Does it get fetishized? Yes. I figured out a long time ago that I have no control over how I am read and how I am promoted. I want to say, for me, writing a novel is not therapy. So I don't sit down to try and figure what's going on with me and whether I don't work that way. I'm usually trying to make the novel work, and that is such a hard task for me, to just make it move in the right order, make it sound real, that the rest don't matter. I go to a psychiatrist, and I've been for like 16 years with the same psychiatrist, to talk about the effect of colonialism on my head.
So I want to go back to the idea of cultural colonialism, and this question is for all of you, and we can start with Raja. All of us on this panel write in English, and we write about predominantly a world that speaks Arabic. So do you feel a kind of, like in Arabic it's like sira, like an internal sira, or some kind of dissonance or disconnect because of that? And tied with that, do you, again, I want to keep going back to this idea of narrating one's own culture and one's own wound. Is it important to you that narratives of oppression be told by voices that are oftentimes actively muted. So I'll start with you, Raja.
I've said already that Palestine has been threatened by its very existence, and we have been denied as a nation that we exist at all. But I think when it comes to language, the Arabic language is not under such scrutiny or threat. I remember once hearing a session in the Edinburgh Book Festival where Amos Oz, the famous Israeli writer, was talking. And then at the end, someone raised their hand and said, "You speak good English. Why don't you write in English?" And he went into a tirade of why it is important for him to write in Hebrew and how important it is to keep on writing in Hebrew, and impossible for him to write in English because that would be a denial of the Hebrew and so on. And then I thought, for me, I've never been apologetic about not writing in Arabic. Arabic language is such a rich language, it has such a rich literature that it doesn't really matter if I don't write in Arabic. The other thing is I like English, and I like the understatement in English, which can't be done in Arabic. The only times when I yearn to write in Arabic is if I could write in colloquial Arabic. And colloquial Arabic is not an Arabic that you can write with, or if you do, then very few readers can understand, only possibly in your small locale. So if I were to write in Arabic, I would be writing in classical Arabic, which is already like a translation from the way I speak. And so that one important matter. The other thing is I live under occupation, and I live under a colonial occupation. And the colonial occupation succeeds by making you estranged from yourself and lost as to what is happening and how it is happening. So for me, writing has been like a crusade of trying to first understand and then communicate what is happening so that we cannot be in confusion, and so that even if in future generations people want to know what happened, they can go back to some of these writings that I and others write and find out what has happened and how it happened. So whether in my law books or in my memoirs, this has been a very important effect to reduce the confusion and the colonial effect of internalizing what the colonialists want to do to us, and how to avoid doing that by keeping up with how he is doing it.
I mean, that was so beautifully put. Yes, my Arabic experience is in Shami, is in the very Syrian dialect, and that isn't something that you can write in Arabic. But also, and I wish I could say that I don't think about these things the way Rabih just said. But the reality is that the dehumanization of people in the Middle East has happened in English in many ways, in English and in French essentially. And it's a position, I think, to write from the position of the hyphen, from the Syrian American position and in English, is a way to, first of all, catch that discourse off guard. People still are like, you're really Syrian? Is your mom not Syrian? Is your dad? I mean, like, I always have to go through like many iterations of how, like, forever I've been, my family is from Syria. And I think there is a power in sort of claiming that language and using it to humanize the people that have been dehumanized by it. But also, I think we have to recognize that our audiences are global. And that many Syrians have read my book in English. And that's not to say that there isn't dehumanization of Arabs happening in Arabic. Absolutely there is. And I would love to see the book translated, but it doesn't capture the Syrian. I mean, we can do it on WhatsApp, we can do it, we can do colloquial, but no, anybody ever actually written a book in colloquial? I know one of the characters in my book, who's the bad guy in my book, was a poet who became famous, or the bad guy. He's a poet and takes our house, but he becomes famous for writing poems in colloquial Arabic. But I don't know, has anybody written a book from start to end in Shami or Lebanese? Or
That's actually a big debate in the Arab world among publishers and stuff. I think some have been written.
I know some who have come close. I mean, I am a fan of Rashid al-Da'if, not the content of the novel, but the language of the Arabic that he uses. It's close to colloquial, but really not. But I don't know anybody else.
So can you address that question about writing in a language that's separate from the world of your characters? Or not separate?
It's actually, that's the thing. For me, English is not separate from the world of me or my characters. Lebanon, the primary languages are supposed to be English, French, and Arabic, but the written Arabic is not our language. Colloquial Arabic is. But for me, more important, I am an American. I've always thought of myself as an American and Lebanese and an Arab. I don't like hyphens. I'm an American. I've lived in my apartment in San Francisco for 40 years. I think in English, I think in Arabic, I think in French. So to say that this language is mine and this language is not. The problem with language and representation is that still to this day, wherever I go, it's as if I'm supposed to represent Lebanon, that I'm supposed to represent the Arab world. I can barely represent me. You know, it's like, I don't understand this. So that this whole idea of, you know, you speak this language, I write in English because it's easier for me. This is, you know, how you read me, I have no control over. But to think that, you know, somebody should read me because I write in English, or they should think that I'm oppressed. Is there a disconnection? Yes, of course there's a disconnection. But for me, again, I was born disconnected. You know, it's like I'm weird. You know, it's like everything about me is weird. I'm not really Lebanese. I'm not really American. I'm not heterosexual. I'm not gay. I'm grumpy. Grumpy.
And so you're okay with a happy person writing a grumpy?
Absolutely. Mm.
So I want to shift gears a little bit. All of us on this panel have what my family would call a proper job, or had a proper education. I have a background in medicine and science. I worked as a researcher. Raja's a lawyer, Alia's a lawyer, and you were trained as an engineer, correct?
I worked for 3 months.
So, I mean, I think in Arab society, and again, this is a broad brushstroke, there is this kind of emphasis on STEM, as STEM science, technology, engineering, and medicine as being sort of more legitimate paths, career paths. Do you, and a lot of times you end up with, you know, writers who have this background and then finally find their way late in life to a true passion. Do you think that this kind of, the prevalence of this kind of outlook in our society steers us in a certain direction, and does it hurt us? Does it hurt us culturally?
Well, I want to say that I wanted to be a writer from an early age, and my father is a lawyer, and my grandfather was a judge, so I come from a legal family. But my father, from the beginning, said, if you become a writer, you will starve. And so he encouraged me very much to go into law. And I did go into law and did write. And I've written a number of successful books. And yet, if I had not heeded his advice and gone into writing alone, I would not be able to live the way I live now and keep the standard of life that I live. The other thing, it has been a freeing thing for me because I've never written for money. If I were a professional writer who survived on his writing, then I would have to sometimes maybe compromise or be anxious in a bad way about having to succeed. And that I have been freed of by having another profession. And I also think, as a writer, between writing and the law, there's no comparison. The writing is the more difficult thing to do, much more difficult than doing law. And I think that it is good for a writer to have his foot in another world, to go out of the house occasionally and deal with the world as it is. It has certainly given me a lot of material for my writing, and I think my father's advice was good advice to me.
You know, in Syria, the university education is free, and the people with the best grades go to the faculty of medicine. Next best grades, engineering. Like law's like kind of like for the remedial students. And I think there's a purpose to that to some extent, because I think doctors and engineers are wonderful for helping to build infrastructure, but they don't really give trouble. Although Bashar al-Assad is, ostensibly a doctor. But ostensibly is. But I think there's something to that idea that these other, like my brother and I have two sisters and a brother. My brother studied economics at Princeton. I became a lawyer. My other two sisters, one's an engineer and one's a doctor. And everybody in Syria thinks like my brother and I are not intelligent, and that, my two sisters, they're the ones that were much more marriageable. They had the better CVs, and I think that is by design in many ways. And all those Syrian doctors as well. There wasn't an economy to sustain them in Syria, or engineers, so they ended up working abroad. So they leave Syria, and I think that suits a totalitarian regime quite well. When your best and your smartest are not they're not thinking about ideas and principles of a free economy or law and rights, whether they're contractual or property or human rights. And doctors and engineers, they're not going to be able, your smart doctors and engineers are not going to be able to find jobs in Syria, so they're gone. So you're sort of left behind to some extent with a more manageable society. And these are the kinds of things that, we think are cultural, but actually, and I can only speak for Syria, I think these are a kind of architecture of maintaining power over so long and keeping a population more docile.
Most of the same thing. The trouble for me is not, I got my engineering degree because I was very good at math, and that's what, I couldn't, like my father said, I could not become a math professor. And I've always wanted to be a writer, and I've always wanted that, so it's not a problem. But what I think the problem is, and I think I may be mistaken, but I think you have the same problem here, is that the emphasis on technical professions, whether it's medicine or engineering, is that in Lebanon, the humanities departments in schools I think it's a sad state. And as I understand it, it might be a sad state here. That there's not as much emphasis on the arts, on what makes us full human. The universities become, in Lebanon at least, the universities become more of a career jump. You go in to get a better job. And that, for me, is sad, because one of the great things for me about my university time was, even though I was taking engineering, my electives was, Shakespeare, and it was a choice that I made because that's what I loved, and I think that choice is becoming less and less in the world.
Do you see trends in how these kinds of social shifts affect society? So, for example, like in the United States, there over the past 30-some years or so, there's been a systematic defunding of the arts and humanities.
And that's how we elect Trump.
Right. Yeah, well, that's kind of where I was getting at. And as opposed to, for example, Canada, where there's, or Scandinavian countries, there's tremendous support for literature and art, and so can you say something about that, and then also react to that relative to the Arab world and emphasis. Do you see trends, I guess, that support for the arts versus in terms of society's political direction?
Definitely. For me, there's a direct link. It might not be causal, but let's say it's correlational between the defunding of humanities and the lack of education. We might be able to do certain things, but we're unable to see the world in general. I am surprised as to how many people, in the United States not only know little about the Arab world, they don't even know where it is. When I say I'm from Lebanon, it has been a number of times is that in Latin America? And I go, yes. And tango, we do tango really well. It's a joke, but it is, the mistaking Sikhs for Muslims, anybody with dark skin is different than us. And that is all because they have not read, or let alone seen, or studied, but even just read. Like to read someone from a different culture is eye-opening. And we've lost that. So we elect Trump. and get depressed. And, again, I mean, I can make fun of Trump, but your prime minister isn't that much better.
Alia, what's your reaction to that?
While I was in Syria, it's really dismaying to see things that happened in Syria in 2011 and 2012 sort of become a kind of playbook for Trump and other leaders around the world today in 2018, 2017. I mean, one of the things that was very disturbing in Syria was that the regime very quickly knew not to let in foreign journalists and had long ago extinguished the idea of a free press. So, I mean, he never used the words fake news in Arabic or in English, but Bashar al-Assad was saying from the start, this is all fake. They said that Al Jazeera...
He was so ahead of his time.
Yeah, he was. From that great medical education he got. My great uncle actually was one of the most esteemed professors at my grandmother, who's the main character in my book, at the University of Damascus Medical School. And when Bashar came in for his oral exams, he was asked to leave. So he didn't. I mean, it's questionable as to whether or not he actually passed. But the first thing he did was challenge that the news was actually real. And you see that happening in the United States with Trump. And also, people in Syria divide. I mean, not everything that happens to Syrians or to Palestinians or Lebanese is only from outside. Of course, people have agency and make decisions even within whatever sort of neuroses or Stockholm syndrome or other complexes that they have. But people in Syria had already divided themselves very quickly into silos of which truth you picked. Was it the Al Jazeera truth or was it the Syrian state TV truth? And it is very dismaying to see the same thing happening in the United States where we have an absolute freedom of choice. Something to think about as we move forward.
Well, the situation in Palestine is strange in the sense that in the post-Oslo Accords time after 2005, there was an attempt at taking people away from political activism and into cultural activism. And as a result, there was so much funding for the cultures and exposure. Because there was interest in Palestinian culture, and so as a result, we've had for a number of years an international dance festival in Ramallah every year, and dance troops from Palestine went around touring in Europe, and likewise in plays, and likewise in films, and likewise in visual art. So there are many galleries which we never used to have, and all the infrastructure for culture has been created in the last few years as a result of the funding and the encouragement. So this is important, I think, but how it will translate into politics is another matter and a difficult matter, and I'm not sure the result, as I see it now, is very good.
Well, I mean, the region suffered from alternatives, and that's why Islamism appeared to be one of the most viable alternatives, because the authoritarian regimes were so suffocating. And I don't know if the studies have been done yet, but if you give a child a different alternative, I think, I've met so many people from the Jenin Freedom Theater who seems like their lives were completely changed by those kinds of opportunities to, from a young age, choose a culture over the sheikhs or the mosque.
Yeah. And that is what it's about children seeing alternatives and seeing themselves as something other than the dominant sort of persona. Rabih, you said something in your last answer on the importance of reading someone from another culture. Once again, I'm going to circle back to cultural colonialism. There's a book that is written by an American soldier. I forget the title of it now, but it's listed.
I don't even know this.
Right. I haven't read it either, and nor do I plan to. But it's written about an Afghan boy and his movement through the world. But it's written by an American soldier who's now kind of considered an expert on Afghan life. So you know, there are people out there who would say, well, I'm reading about another culture. And this is, you know, can you kind of talk about that, about people from a dominant imperial culture writing, especially writing in first person, because I think that's an important distinction, to inhabit the life of people who are basically voiceless, who are pushed to live on the margins of humanity, and writing in their voice and basically interpreting their lives for the rest of the world. So, and then other people can, you know, read these books and say, oh, I'm reading another culture.
Well, the most important thing that I keep coming back to, everybody has the right to write about whatever they want. The difference is that you don't get the right to not be criticized. So I criticize everybody because I really hate all books out there. But specifically those, it's always amusing to see the assumptions made by somebody not of the culture about the culture. But it is, to me, that's not the problem, as bad as that is. Or it is a problem, but I have bigger problems, is that there are no Afghan writers that people are reading, so that there's nothing to compare to, so that the voice of this white male Muslim, I mean a Marine, or it becomes the voice of the Afghan people. And even if you have one writer from Afghanistan, that becomes the voice of the Afghan people. And that, to me, is terrifying. Again, when I am introduced and put on a panel like this to basically speak about the Arab world, it frightens me. And I go back to my psychiatrist, and we'll talk about that. The whole idea of that who gets to represent is fascinating to me. And to me, if you want to talk about the Afghan people, then read something by an Afghan and read a lot of things by Afghans. You'll start to get a glimpse of what it's like. Not even, so the fact that you're reading this book written by a Marine and think you know something is just fascinating. And I'm using fascinating in a derogatory manner.
I would like to just say that there actually are Afghan writers. They don't necessarily write in English, but there are opportunities to translate from Pashto and Urdu. There's always artists in every society, and it's a question of whether or not we want to take the effort, or publishing houses want to make the effort to find these and give voice to those folks.
And also just say, sorry, just the thing is, yes, it takes a lot of gall to sort of have gone over to Afghanistan and Iraq, kill the hell out of people, then become like a CIA, and then write 2 books in their voices. But fine, everyone has a right to do that. But that gets, you know, like these got reviewed multiple times, ecstatically, and they were almost always reviewed by other white men. And they were some of these books were shortlisted, longlisted. I mean, so the problem is sort of also with the institutions that sort of embrace this, because, I mean, I cannot imagine today in the United States an ex-American, white American cop who had killed black people, then writing in the voice of a Black Lives activist. I mean, they share a language at least. I mean, it is the gall with which this person, and other people have done this is one thing, but it's also the gall of all the publishing houses and then the reviewers and the critics that do not call this out for what it is. I mean, it is interesting in an era of hashtag everything, hashtag Me Too, hashtag Black Lives Matters, that you can still do this to Arab and Muslims or brown or other brown people, that this is like so patently, obviously like gauche and not only not sort of like, cause revulsion, but get celebrated. And that's a problem that's on all of our shoulders, not just the writers who write it. And we should make an effort to seek out and buy, where possible, the works of the because the market responds to consumers, unfortunately. So we do have power in the choices that we make.
Sorry, just one thing. How could you not, for me, my favorite thing is I always say, well, of course you know the culture. You killed most of the people there, so you get the right to write about them.
Yeah, it's true. What I did, I was on a panel with this person that we were not referring to by name, and when I told that CIA joke, I did make sure to just keep pointing at him every time I said CIA, but that was like my minor resistance.
Raja, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that in the case of Palestine, there were a number of very good books out of Palestine in Arabic all throughout that were never translated or reached in international public, because Palestine was censored. The first time I was able to use the word Palestine on a book of mine was in 2000. And when the publisher agreed, it was Strangers in the House, Coming of Age in Occupied Palestine, published in 2000. And when the publisher agreed to have the word Palestine appear on the title, I said, "Are you sure?" He said, "Yeah, I think we can do it." And now, of course, Palestine is mentioned all the time, but it has taken a long time before we could even recognize or identify ourselves as Palestinian. So there has been a big shift.
Yeah. Ali, I'm really glad that you sort of push some of the responsibility onto institutions, because that is, there is a huge responsibility there in the people who give credibility and legitimacy to books that really are stealing other people's pain and stealing and writing from it and profiting from it. Are you, again, shifting gears, are you all translated into Arabic?
I am.
You are? Are you, Rabih?
I have one. The others are banned, which
Wonderful.
is why I write in English.
We need to just touch on that in some of the time we have left. What about you, Alia?
I've been asked about the Syria book, but I've held off just because, like, I don't know if I don't think this regime reads a lot. I mean, writers are not significant necessarily, but like if it gets translated into Arabic, then then people might, even though I've changed names and stuff, then people might be in a little more danger. Or
So, Rabih, I want to focus on you because you write novels and fiction, and you write about. But maybe we should start. Yeah, good points. I guess we'll just close it. I was hoping to touch on like reactions from different readers. But let's open it up for the audience to ask some questions in the last 10 minutes. We have a question here, the gentleman in blue.
Hello, can you listen to me? Now, you see, come from Middle East, and this Middle East becoming more and more unstable and dangerous, militarily speaking. You have this Saudi Arabia, and you have Iran, and this Trump, and his missiles. Do you think in 1 year or two, in near future, the war can break out a serious war, and what will be the consequences?
Who wants to take that?
I write novels. I have enough problems figuring out what the next sentence is. You're asking me about war in the Middle East?
We have a question here with the young lady.
Hi, I really enjoyed this panel. I'm an Indian who grew up in the Arab world, so I found all your insights very interesting. Rabih, I've actually read some of your work, and I was a big fan until you said that the Indian Prime Minister is no better than Trump, because I think they are vastly different. I mean, the Indian Prime Minister is a very capable administrator. He has a positive vision for this country, and a lot of the intolerance you read about is in newspaper articles and TV. So don't believe everything the New York Times says is one thing I'll say. My question is really for Alia. I was wondering, I just got a copy of your book. I'm very excited about it. But do you have a comment on the Syrian refugee experience also? Because I know now they're in so many different countries and they're facing many challenges. Could you speak about it?
Yeah, well, I am going to use the opportunity, even if I'm just a writer. I will just say that in the last century alone, Syria took in refugees from the Armenian genocide, the Palestinian dispossession, the Iraqi invasions, and it is, I wish I could now believe in karma, but the fact that, that now that they've become refugees themselves, and that Syria offers refuge to nobody as a country, even after over a century of providing refuge. Lebanese during the Civil War came to Syria. That is, that's a blemish on all of us. That we can, that we have decided to treat Syrians of all people like this, or that we treat anybody like this. But the reality is, the refugee crisis, everybody wants to go. I have walked from Greece to Germany with refugees. I did an illustrated guide for refugees. I've written a story. I'm working on a long-term book about what happens to both Europe and Syria. I mean, everybody would rather go home to some extent. I mean, the presumption that Syria is a beautiful place, Palestine is a beautiful place, Lebanon is a beautiful place, but it's not going to happen when, when you cannot actualize your full potential in these places, and that is the situation that we're in. And as for Modi and all these things, I mean, like, nothing is ever 100% one way or the other. And the Syrian question has managed to really splinter people's understanding. People who should be able to understand this for what it is are kind of confused because of this idea that the left is not, the left prefers Assad to ISIS. I mean, many of these guys are two sides of one coin, and until you sort of take a moment to really understand the history and the politics of what's going on there, these conversations can only be superficial.
Gentleman here, and then you. In the plaid shirt.
The common theme that seems to be emerging about the Arab writing is that they're writing...
Can you speak up just a little?
The common theme seems to be, in the Arab writing, is that they're writing in times of conflict, internal civil war and conflict. But in terms of human relationships, is there a difference between how the women writers write about those relationships and the men writers? Thank you.
I'm sorry, is there a difference in, did you catch that?
How Arab women writers,
Okay.
because in the Muslim world, they're less equal than men. How is the women writers' gaze different from the men writers?
Rabih, why don't you and I take this, because we write fiction. I think, this perception that, women occupy a particular lower standard in the Muslim world as opposed to the lower standard in the rest of the world. I think women everywhere occupy a lower level in society. And I think the way we write and what we write is always going to be, I think when there's this power imbalance, it's going to be different. And the way I see it is because oftentimes, as women, we are, I think no matter where you are, we are conditioned to be sensitive to men, to condition our behavior on sparing their ego and what have you. There's a whole range of behavior standards that we are indoctrinated with to accommodate men. And so we become more aware of the lives of men, I think, than men are aware of our lives. And I think that's always the case when there's a power gradient, whether it's a racial gradient, a gender gradient, a national gradient, a religious gradient when it comes to power. So I think that those without power are more in tune with those who dominate them with their lives. And so I think we write with that kind of nuance that doesn't always work in reverse, which is why, another reason why I think that cultural colonialism is a real thing. So,
all I can say is, have you read books by women? Because if you have, that question becomes completely meaningless. The trouble is that for most of us, we don't read books by women. Most of the reviews in the papers are not books about women, so we think women write about relationships. Women write about a whole lot of fucking things. We should read them.
Write about everything. Thank you, Rabih. The young man in the black shirt.
Thank you. First of all, the comment that was made by Sir, I think it was... First of all, the comment made by Sir, I think it was regarding the communalistic feelings that are being arisen in the country as of now. Other than that, the question to the panel that I have is, in Israel, not condoning the actions of the present government, of course, who do you think is to blame for the subjugation of the Arab community? Is it the British plan to either give the land to the Jews, or divide the land, or promise it to the French, or keep it for themselves? So it was actually the Britishers who started this whole ordeal? Or do you blame the present government in inciting such communalistic feelings? Or, well, yes, how do you blame aggressive nationalism, the Zionism that's propagating? What exactly, which factors do you blame for the present subjugation of the Arab community in Israel and Palestine?
Why do we have to choose?
So, because I would like to know of them. I mean, how many factors do you think there are? And if you could just introduce the audience to them.
I'm going to let Raja take that, but we call them Palestinians, not Arabs necessarily. Even, I mean, just.
I think the blame is not the important thing at this point. At this point, the point is that there is an Israeli nation, there is a Palestinian nation, and the question is how to live together. And I think the main responsibility for not even beginning to go in that direction at this point is that of Israel, which refuses to come to terms with the very existence of the Palestinians as a nation. And that is the biggest problem.
I just want to add on to that. I actually do think that there is blame, and it's not just. There's a whole world that empowers Israel to continue to dispossess and deny and oppress and brutalize. So they are the principal actors who are destroying Palestinian lives and erasing us from the world. But there's a whole world out there that supports them both politically and materially through economic cooperation, military cooperation, and political cover at international bodies. So do we have, I think we're out of time. Thank you all very much. This was a lovely discussion. Thanks.
For such an illuminating session, our thanks go to Alia Malek.